So again, chemical bond here, it's a covalent bond, the electrons are shared, another one over here. However, notice that the electrons are not shared equally between the atoms in something like water. And the reason being is because oxygen is a larger atom versus hydrogen. And that's shown here, right? Oxygen's bigger. Because it's larger, it has a stronger ability or a better ability to pull electrons towards it. And it will. So the electrons, the two electrons that are involved in the covalent bond between hydrogen and oxygen are not equally shared because the bigger atom will pull the electrons slightly closer to it. Right? Simply because it's bigger, it's stronger, if you want to think of it that way, and the electrons get pulled a little bit closer to the oxygen. Because of that, the electrons are not like right in the middle, equally shared, they're unequally shared, they're pulled closer to the oxygen. Okay? So that means that the negatively charged electrons, if you remember, they're negatively charged. In the nucleus of the atom, there's neutrons and protons, and the protons are positively charged. All right? So these negatively charged electrons are pulled a little closer to the oxygen. Because of that, there's a charge distribution, an unequal distribution of the negative charge on the electrons. The electrons are pulled slightly closer to this end of this molecule. And again, that's because the oxygen is larger than the hydrogens. The electrons are pulled slightly towards the oxygen, and that means the negative charge of the electrons is going to build up or accumulate on the oxygen end of this molecule. Because of that, this end of the molecule is slightly negative. And because of that, the hydrogen ends are slightly positive. There's a charge distribution across this molecule for two reasons. The main, most important reason is oxygen is larger than the hydrogen. Okay? So this end is negative, these ends are positive. The other reason is, well, the molecule is bent, so the negative end is going to be on this end, and the positive end is going to be on this part or this region or these ends of the water molecule. All right? We say that this molecule has a polarity. Negative end, slightly negative, not like a -1, but slightly negative. And then on the opposite sides, or the other ends where the hydrogens are, slightly positive. And again, as I mentioned, water is a bent molecule, and that makes water an interesting molecule, as we'll talk about soon. Okay? The unequal charge distribution, the unequal sharing of the electrons, and the molecule being bent makes water a polar molecule. Polar means there's going to be a slight negative end somewhere and a slight positive end somewhere. Because of the uneven distribution of the electrons and their negative charge, and because water in particular is a bent molecule. So, because of that, if you think of a glass of water, it doesn't have one molecule of water, it has like trillions and trillions. And when those molecules are all sloshing around in a glass of water, or in a lake, or in a river, or in the ocean, the negative end, the slightly negative end of oxygen, is weakly attracted to the slightly positive end, where the hydrogens are. And this occurs with all of the surrounding water molecules. These weak attractions between the slightly positive end on hydrogen and the slightly negative end on oxygen, that weak interaction, it's relatively weak, is called a hydrogen bond. Okay? So the polarity of water results in the weak electrical attractions between neighboring water molecules, the slightly negative ends and the slightly positive ends. Those interactions are called hydrogen bonds. They're much weaker than ionic bonds, and they're much, much weaker than covalent bonds. But they are significant. and they give water interesting characteristics as a liquid. So, a little video on water.
The atoms that make up a water molecule are in a constant tug-of-war over their shared electrons. Oxygen exerts a far stronger pull on the shared electrons than does hydrogen, and so the electrons spend more of their time closer to the oxygen atom. Because of this unequal sharing of electrons, the oxygen atom in a water molecule actually has a slight negative charge, and each hydrogen atom has a slight positive charge, even though the water molecule as a whole is neutral. Because of the unequal sharing of electrons and the resulting positive and negative poles, a water molecule is said to be polar. The polarity of water molecules causes them to be attracted to each other. Since the positively charged atom involved in this special type of attraction is always a hydrogen atom, this kind of bond between molecules is called a hydrogen bond. Each water molecule can hydrogen bond to 4 other water molecules. A hydrogen bond is weak and lasts only a tiny fraction of a second, but it takes a lot of energy to overcome the combined attraction of many hydrogen bonds. This explains water's great capacity to store heat, its high boiling point, surface tension, and several other unusual properties.
Okay, so the relatively weak hydrogen bonds between the separate water molecules individually are very weak, but combined, like all of them in, say, a glass of water, the strength of those relatively weak hydrogen bonds is significant, and that's one reason why water can absorb a lot of heat and release it slowly. Think of boiling water. When you're going to put a pot of water to boil, you have to turn up the heat and you have to let it heat up for quite a long time before the water actually boils. And when the water is boiling, what happens is some of the water molecules break off from the liquid and go up into the air as water vapor, water molecules. And that only happens when there's enough energy inputted by heat to break all of the hydrogen bonds. Okay? So individually they're very weak, but combined, the strength of all the different hydrogen bonds that are possible can be relatively strong. So, moving on to water and its significance for life. So, life on Earth began in water. The debate is where in water, but most likely in the ocean. The debate is either near shore, and more recently at deep oceanic hot water vents. But we'll get into that in later chapters. Okay? So, life evolved in water, and it evolved in water for about 3 billion years, a very long time before it moved on to land. And again, we'll talk about that in subsequent chapters. So life is still tied to water. For example, in our body, all our cells, they're basically elaborate, fancy little sacks of water, anywhere from 70 to 95% water. We are terrestrial, we live on dry land, but most of our body is made up of water. So the structure and function of water is essential for life. So the polarity of water molecules and the hydrogen bonding that exists between the separate water molecules explains a lot of the important properties of water that is important for life to exist. So 4 important properties of water, or characteristics of water. The cohesion of water. Okay, so the hydrogen bonding between separate water molecules gives water what's called cohesion. That's why if you put a droplet of water on a slick surface, it'll form a little water droplet. Or if you have, say, water between 2 surfaces, the surfaces will kind of stick together a little bit because water has cohesion because of the hydrogen bond. As I mentioned, water has the ability to resist temperature changes, so to moderate temperature. The water in our bodies acts as a temperature regulator. Our body temperatures will rise slowly because we have so much water, and our body temperature will drop slowly because we have so much water. Same thing for lakes and oceans. The oceans on the planet are basically temperature. Well, they serve as temperature moderators. During the daytime, the oceans absorb heat from the sunlight, and at nighttime they slowly radiate it away from the water body, and they slowly radiate it out into space. And then the biological significance of ice floating is critical. What happens when you put an ice cube in a drink? Does the ice cube sink to the bottom? It floats on the surface of the drink because the drink is mostly water, liquid water. So solid water, ice, is less dense, less heavy than liquid water. You might be like, okay, what's the big deal? Well, think of a lake or a river maybe, but a lake in the northern parts of the United States or in Canada, and it's wintertime. What happens? The surface of the water freezes over. You can walk on it, skate on it, play hockey. Underneath, there's nice cold liquid water, because the ice as it forms stays on the top. It doesn't sink to the bottom. And since ice itself can act as an insulating structure, the liquid water below can stay liquid and allow life to exist underneath the ice, like fish and plants. If ice did not float, if ice was denser than water, heavier, it would sink to the bottom, and as it remained cold, or as the temperatures drop, a lake would freeze from the bottom all the way up to the surface, so the entire lake would be a solid chunk of ice, and fish in there would be, well, frozen to death. Okay? And the versatility of water as a solvent. In our cells and in rivers and oceans, etc., water can dissolve a lot of substances. And a solvent is a liquid that can dissolve a substance, and the substance becomes a solute. So think of a glass of water, you put sugar in it, the sugar dissolves, now you have a solution of sugar water. The water is the solvent, the sugar is a solute, and then the mixture is called a solution. And that's important because at the cellular level in our bodies, there's a lot of chemical reactions occurring, and there's a lot of substances that are dissolved in water. Again, because our cells are mostly water. Okay, the cohesion of water. So molecules stick together because of the hydrogen bonding, and that's called cohesion. That's why you get a curved surface. It's called a meniscus, like in a cylinder with water. And literally, that's how water gets from the roots in trees, up the trunk, to the branches, all the way to the leaves. And that's essential because, as we'll learn later, photosynthesis happens in the leaves, and photosynthesis is only possible with water. Okay, so trees and plants absorb water in the roots. Think of a tree that's 100 feet tall. How the hell does the water get up to the leaves? The water basically kind of gets sucked up through cohesion, or the cohesion of water, because in the leaves, as we'll find out, water evaporates, and the little stream of water, in terms of water vapor, evaporation, is leaving the leaves. Well, as that water is leaving the leaves, the stickiness, cohesion of water, is pulling water up all the way from the roots. Trees and plants don't have a pump like a heart that would propel the water. The water moves up through the cohesion characteristic of water. So trees depend on this water cohesion to transport water from the roots all the way up to the leaves, which is kind of pretty amazing. Okay, so let's look at water transport video, and this video is only about 40 seconds long. We can handle it here.
How does water get from the roots of a tree to its leaves? How does water get from the roots of a tree to its leaves? The evaporation of water from leaves moves water molecules up from the roots. The evaporation exerts a pull that is relayed downward along a string of water molecules from leaf to root. Hydrogen bonds cause water molecules to stick together, a phenomenon called cohesion. As each water molecule evaporates, it pulls on the next water molecule, and it pulls on the next. This relays the pull of evaporating water molecules all the way down to the roots. The cohesion of water helps to keep gravity from pulling the water molecules back down.
Pretty amazing.